Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, board members. Good to see you. Like Brian mentioned, we're going to go through the presentation. So what we wanted to do this morning is quickly go through an update on some of the items we're working on, just like Brian mentioned. But before that, I kind of want to go through a reminder of what the locally preferred alternative is, which you adopted in August of last year of 2021. And I know for everyone in the room, we definitely understand we've been having this conversation for quite some time as in regards to the different elements involved in that recommendation for that locally preferred alternative. It includes everything from some dedicated BRT lanes to operating in mixed traffic, as well as express lanes. But what we did recognize is, having that conversation with the general public is not that easy. With so many different elements, it gets confusing quick. So what we've developed is a public friendly video that we're going to put up to the website. I'm going to show you that video now. But we wanted to just give you guys a preview today. Again, just a quick video talking about what the LPA is. More importantly for this morning's conversation is, we understand what the locally preferred alternative is. What are some of those treatments that we're looking at in terms of how the alignment works? But the next question is, how does the service operate? So how long during the day does it operate? How frequent? And how does it make those connections to those different stations? So we've gone through a number of different iterations over the years in identifying what would be the preferred operating plan for the RRT and the locally preferred alternative, always focused on performance and of course cost. And what we're looking at right now is essentially a service plan that includes a total of 4 combined routes. Within those 4 routes, we're anticipating about 22 vehicles needed to run the service. Right now, at this point in time, we're assuming that those are hybrid diesel vehicles. You can see roughly the approximate cost operationally per year to run that service at just being over 7 million, 7.5 million. You'll notice that in the center of our region, there's multiple routes that are overlapping. So what happens in those areas is because of the overlapping routes, we actually get a higher effective headway because you have, like I said, multiple routes operating at the same time. In those areas, our highest frequency is about 7.5 minutes connections to each one of those stations. We're also looking at providing the service between 6 a.m. in the morning and all the way up to 10 p.m. in the evening. The importance of having those late evening hours is the opportunity to continue to serve folks within the community, make sure they can get to jobs, even if they're not traditional 9-to-5 jobs. So some of the other unique parts of this 4-route plan, and I'm going to go through each one of the routes individually here in the next couple of slides, but we do have some great opportunities to have a 1-seat ride from Pasco all the way to downtown Tampa. We also have a 1-seat ride from St. Pete to Tampa. And that breakpoint in downtown Tampa is really predicated on all the data that we've looked at over the years. We know that that's really where the core 2 travel markets are within our region, north to Tampa, and then of course, St. Pete to Tampa. But I talked a little bit about that opportunity to leave the interstate and make that direct connection to the airport. We've also been looking at the opportunity to leave the interstate and make a direct connection to the USF campus at the UATC. Obviously, FDOT is looking at initiating their PD&E to look at some potential improvements to Fowler Avenue. HART is also working on some concepts for bus rapid transit that might also be on that corridor. So again, this I think is an opportunity to partner with those local initiatives, complement them, take advantage of some of those investments to actually serve the residents or the students directly that are going to the campus. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start going through each one of those individual routes. The first route we call Route A is really 54 in Pasco all the way to West Shore. We're looking at every 15 minutes during the peak, every hour going to the airport. So it won't be every 15 minutes, but once an hour that would go directly to the airport. And you can see the list of stations listed here, which includes not only getting access to a station roughly around the interstate, Nebraska and Fowler area, but as well as that deviation that could potentially go directly to the University of South Florida campus. So that's the first route, Route A. Next slide is Route B. Now this would be occurring during off peaks, really just connecting Wesley Chapel to USF. You can see the stations listed there. The third route, or naming Route C, next slide, is strictly between the USF area and the West Shore area. Again, this is looking at 15-minute service, hourly service to the airport. You can see the stations served here as well. And the last route, Route D, is 15-minute all-day service going straight from downtown St. Pete to Tampa, serving all the stations here, including 2 stations in downtown St. Pete, Pinellas Park, Gateway, the airport, West Shore, and downtown Tampa. Next slide, Chris. So we just wanted to make sure we brought this information in front of the board today for any questions or for clarifications. Mr. Chair, I can pause here for questions, or in the essence of time, we can continue on.
Let's continue.
Okay. Next slide, please. So Mr. Ball is here with me today. What we really wanted to do is make sure that we're honoring the really robust conversation that occurred at this board in November of last year in regards to electric vehicles and the opportunity for electric vehicles on this project. So I'm going to have Bill go through some of the technology and then some of the things we'd like to actually review with you in the next couple of months.
Thanks, Scott. And Mr. Chair, members of the board, Bill Ball with Benish. Tyndall Oliver is now Benish. Thank you for mentioning that, Brian. You remember a little over a year ago, we started the technology discussion for vehicles with the board. And at that time, we identified the 5 technologies that we were looking at. They're indicated on this slide: the diesel, hybrid electric, battery electric, compressed natural gas, and the hydrogen fuel cell. So we spent time looking at those technologies, looking at other systems around the country, what they've been using, what their experiences are. And we really had 3 types of considerations that we looked at. There's performance, there's cost, and there's policy. So we're going to share just a little bit about that today, and specifically talk about policy from your perspective, and get your feedback going forward. Next slide. This gives you history back into the 90s as to the types of vehicle technologies that bus systems around the United States have used. So you can see the gold bar, that's diesel buses. Back in the 90s, practically every bus that was operated was diesel. So you see how that's changed over the years with alternative technologies. And that's down to less than 50% of the bus fleets around the country. One thing I'll note is you look at the alternative fuels on this slide, you see other alternatives, but you don't see battery electric. That's because it's such a small part of the total fleet in the country. It's not even showing up on the graph really. It's part of other, so you don't see a lot of it yet. I'll give you some anecdotal information about that. If you think about how many buses are operating in the United States, about 75,000 buses last year. In 2019, there was about 450 buses deployed that were battery electric. Now in 2020, that's up to about 1,000, so it more than doubled. And then in 2021, it's up to about 3,500. So it's 3.5 times. So you can see the trajectory is really going up in terms of growth of battery electric, but it's not moved the needle much on the total amount of fleet out there. But that technology is changing rapidly. And we really think about a project that's going to be, if it's 10 years down the road when this project ultimately operates, for example, will the battery technology be there? Probably will. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So these are a few BRT projects around the country that provide information about the vehicles that they chose to move forward with in the last few years. It's just some good examples that give you the type of vehicle they chose in terms of the technology, the size of the vehicle. A lot of them are the 60-foot articulated vehicles. It really depends on the demand for the service and the amount of capacity you need on those vehicles. You see the manufacturers and the cost per vehicle at the time that those vehicles were purchased for these projects. Sunrunner is on here as well. You can see they chose the hybrid electric, and that's the Gillig brand, a 40-foot bus, and it was about $832,000 per vehicle at the time that they purchased those vehicles. So just some background to help us give a range of cost for what we might think about going forward. Next slide. This is that range of cost by technology. You can see that the electric technologies are the most expensive still, but the costs are continuing to come down pretty consistently from year to year as that technology continues to mature and there's more implementation. But it gives you an idea that hydrogen is not that highly utilized. Few applications, largely in other parts of the world, but battery electric has come a long way, but it's still in the range of $1 to $1.5 million per vehicle. You can see that diesel is the least expensive, and that's the one that's been around the longest. So that just gives you a range from high to low for each of those technologies. Next slide. One of the challenges, if we were to implement this project today, that we might have concerns about is you look at vehicle range on a full charge. Today's technology, or at least in the last couple of years, and it's changing year to year in this technology, it's about 175 miles for a full charge. So depending on the type of service you're going to operate, that might become a challenge, or you might need to have on-route charging to allow that to continue happening throughout the day, you know, while it's charging. But I will say that when you look at the last couple of years, that amount of vehicle range for battery electric continues to go up. So if we say 5, 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be more and more feasible to have battery electric for almost any type of transit service going forward. But you can see the range that comes from the other technologies, which is why it was a challenge in years past. And now that's changing as the technology of batteries continues to improve. So obviously we're down to recommending either hybrid or electric or battery electric and comparing it to the cost of diesel. So you're familiar with the both from the capital cost and from the operating and maintenance cost. Depends on when you implement the project. If we had to choose today, we would be a little concerned about going battery electric because you would have to add a lot more vehicles to accommodate the range issue. But if this project likely will be implemented years down the road, then it becomes even more feasible to move to that battery electric. And that's the kind of discussion we want to have with the board today. Next slide. This is the cost comparison if it were 22 vehicles for each technology. So it gives you an idea of what that would be. Again, Commissioner, this is the upfront capital cost, not the benefits that you get that come later with the operating and maintenance cost and associated with that. So obviously it's going to be a little more expensive upfront. Again, that continues to fall each year as there are more and more deployed out there, then the manufacturers are able to reduce their prices as well. And that's continuing to happen. Next slide. Oh, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, talk a little bit about next steps.
So just as Bill mentioned, really what we wanted to hear from the board today is slight modifications to that locally preferred alternative. We were looking at those hybrid diesel vehicles based on the conversation we had in November and the actions and conversations that are happening at each one of the trans agency boards. We like to make sure that we're not going off the reservation. We're heading in the right direction, doing some additional analysis to look at what the costs would be and how electric vehicles could be implemented on this corridor. You know, we've got to look at everything from the length of the route, how many people are on the bus itself, how much AC are you running, what, you know, how many hills do you have to climb? So we can look at all those things and look at whether or not you're doing charging at your depot center, or you've got some en route chargers. You can see some of the costs here for a depot charger, up to 260,000, where en route chargers can be as much as 590,000 per charger. The benefit of an en route charger is you're not having to pull that vehicle offline, having it sit to charge. You have opportunities to charge it along the route. But we'd like to do some additional analysis to understand what is the spacing of those chargers in order to specifically to serve the RRT, given the length of the corridor. So next slide, please, Chris. We've got a really fancy tool that does this very thing. It was actually first developed when LA Metro converted to electric. Big property. It's definitely a very well-tested tool. And what we're asking of the board today is, you know, can we do this additional analysis, look at what the cost impacts are for the RRT, those infrastructure costs, those operating benefits, the potential need for a little bit bigger fleet size that are all electric vehicles to make the service we described earlier. And we'd like to come back to you at the next board meeting with some of those details and more discussion. That concludes my presentation as well.